What started as a single donut shop in Hamilton more than 50 years ago has now morphed into more than 4,500 locations with 100,000 employees and revenues of more than $3 billion a year. Yes, the donut business is lucrative, and few know as much about it as Douglas Hunter, who has chronicled the explosive growth of the company we like to call Timmy's in his book Double Double, How Tim Hortons Became a Canadian Way of Life, One Cup at a Time. And Douglas Hunter joins us now for more. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome back to TVO.
Thank you.
It's been a long time.
It's been a while.
Last time you were here, I'm trying to remember, was it the Scotty Bowman
Could have been
book?
Scotty Bowman in 1998,
I think so. The first question I want to ask you is, it's so funny that for an institution that is so popular, I'm betting 3/4 of the people who walk into Tim Hortons have no idea who Tim Horton even was.
Yeah, and that's probably pretty fair, because even when I wrote about him initially, I wrote his biography in 1994, and at the time there were maybe 1,000 restaurants, which is still kind of a pretty big deal, but lots of pockets of the country where they were a little weak. But if you asked the average person at that point, I think the majority would not have any idea who he was.
Why not?
I think it goes back literally to Tim Horton himself when the chain first started growing with his partner Ron Joyce, where Joyce legitimately felt that the name, the personality of the sports hero kind of guy, which a lot of people had tried in restaurants of various kinds. It might get you in the door the first time, but it wasn't going to get you the repeat customers. And Horton himself was really uncomfortable as a public persona.
He was very shy, wasn't he?
He was very shy. People that went to, he had chicken and burger restaurants before that, and the whole team would come out the Leafs, and the players, his teammates at the time had told me about, we'd be out in the front signing the autographs and be like, Tim's in the back looking at the chicken. It's not like he didn't like people. He really did, but it was just in a very private way. He did not like being a celebrity.
So let's tell the story then. Tim Horton was, in my childhood, like one of the greatest defensemen in the history of the NHL, and played how many years? Like 25 years of pro hockey?
That's right. Yeah, most of them with the Maple Leafs, and then he went through a series of teams in the early 70s.
What was his hockey career like?
He was a great defenseman. He started out as a rushing defenseman. He got the slap shot very early in the game in the early 50s. He was able to stay in a long time because of the nature of being a defenseman. You could be a stay-at-home guy. You didn't have to have the speed. And as the game expanded with the WHA, the quality of the player pool diluted, and a guy like Tim, who could play a stay-at-home game and be a mentor to young players, there was a role for him in the game. So he could play into his 40s. I mean, I don't know if he would have lasted like Gordie Howe in his 50s, but people wanted him to be there.
And he did play in the NHL well into his 40s.
Yeah, he was 44, I guess, when he died.
Now, his public life, because he was an all-star and, of course, beloved by many people in Toronto and across the country, for that matter, was one thing. His private life was something completely different. What was going on there?
Private life, you can look at it a couple ways. If you want to talk specifically about what was it like at home and with his wife Lori, they had a very tumultuous relationship, which really became public in the 1990s when Lori Horton sued to try to get half the company back after she had sold her half, inherited half from Tim Horton was killed in a car accident in 1974.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that, but just so people understand, there was a death. And then she inherited 49.5%. It's the way that shares worked. But at the time, through that period, Lori, she was hooked on Dexamyl, which was an amphetamine that a lot of women were prescribed for as a diet pill. She had drug and alcohol problems, and that was actually her case, when she sued, because she was mentally incompetent at the time. Tim himself had an unhappy relationship with alcohol.
Was he violent at home?
He could be. Lori told me Lori died in 2000. But Lori told me there was a bad incident in '73 where they were up at the cottage. He went into town, basically broke up a bar, came back, and she said he tried to choke her. And at that point, he agreed he needed counseling. And they found the old Leaf team doctors set him up. And teammates in Buffalo at the time, Jimmy Schoenfeld and others, Dave Dryden, I believe, had told me that he may have had a drink, but in their mind, he was not drinking in the last year of his career.
For all of that as well, though, he lived in Scarborough. Everybody knew where he lived. They knocked on the house door, right? Can we have an autograph? Can we have a picture?
Yeah, he was very much, he was the kind of guy, and then he had his house in Willowdale, and he moved around a little bit, had a custom home up in the north end of Toronto. But yeah, he was a guy that would go out on the street and play street hockey with kids. And it wasn't because, come over and take my picture because aren't I famous? And he actually didn't like it when he was doing charitable type stuff. He did not like it in the newspaper. He just wanted to. I think he was not unlike, a guy wrote about later, Steve Eisenman, who really never took the game for any more than it was. He loved playing it, appreciated what it brought to his life, but did not see himself as this public persona that, could make more out of it.
So here's the business now. We're going to talk about the plaque that is on store number 1. And here's what the bronze plaque on the side of store number 1 is. Not an official historical marker, you tell us, but rather a creation of Tim Hortons that dedicates the site to the making of a dream. And it reads in whole, "This site is dedicated to the dream that lived in the hearts of Tim Horton and Ron Joyce, to the commitment and dedication of the operators who have built the Tim Hortons chain, and to the people of Hamilton, whose undying loyalty has been the backbone of our chain's success. This location signifies the history and heritage of Tim Hortons and will serve as a monument to even bigger dreams yet to come." How much of any of that is actually accurate?
I think in spirit, it's true. It is Ron Joyce and Tim Horton built this franchise system together. What it doesn't tell you, and histories get telescoped, and Tim Horton himself did it all the time, is that it forgets that there was all these burger and chicken restaurants to start with, and most important, it forgets that there's Jimmy Charade.
So who's Jim Charade?
So Jimmy Charade was this part-time jazz drummer from Montreal who came to Toronto and was managing a donuts manufacturing shop for Vachon in Scarborough, and Jimmy got into his head that people would like to buy donuts on the street, not through their Dominion store like Vachon. So he started his own donut. He opened one at Lawrence and Ellesmere called Your Donut. It went through another phase, and then because there's a barber shop 2 doors down, Tim happened to walk into that barbershop one day. They had a mutual friend, and they said, "Oh, this is Jimmy and this is Tim." And then they got together, and the next thing you know, Jimmy was licensing Tim's name for a donut store.
How ethical a businessman was Jimmy?
Jimmy, I don't think was unethical. The best description I ever heard of Jim, and he died a couple years ago, was Jim was a guy who was going 30 miles an hour in a car that was going 25. He just kind of was always a little further ahead of things than he should have been. So the crisis, if you can call it, with Tim was they had the chain of burger and chicken places in and around Toronto, which were doing not very well. But that's what they had their money in. And on the other side, Jim was trying to make this donut thing happen. And he was only licensing Tim's name for it. Tim had no equity in that at all. So as Lori told me, they went away for a cruise, one Christmas or whatever, and then when they came back, as she put it, all the money was gone. And what Jimmy had done is he'd taken the money out of the chicken stuff side, burger side, and he moved it over to fix things on the donut side. He didn't take it and put it in an account in Panama. He was trying to save the other side of the business. But the fact was that Tim had no interest in that side of the business.
And I don't think he told Tim that he did that.
He hadn't totally did it. He was just moving stuff around.
So why has he been airbrushed out of basically the official history of Tim Hortons?
Well, he's an awkward detail, but I think Tim was always genuinely a friend of his, even when they had trouble. He actually went back and worked for Ron Joyce at Tim Hortons long after Tim died. He came back and did real estate for them in the 1990s. So I think it's just when you try to tell a story, it's easy just to say, "Oh, it was me and Ron, my buddy the cop." And in fact, Tim would tell that story. He would tell stories like when I was playing in Pittsburgh for the American League, there was a donut stop down the road, and I always loved donuts, and I always wanted to have a donut store. Well, it's a nice little story, but it really has no basis in reality. He had no interest in donuts until Jimmy Charade came along.
You've mentioned it twice, and I think we have to go there right now. He was playing for the Buffalo Sabres at the time. His last game was at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. He played well. The fans loved him. They cheered like crazy for him. And then he got in his Ford Pantera after the game, and what happened?
He had been, just to back up just a little bit on the story, he had been hit in the face with a puck in a practice just before the game, a couple days before the game, and they weren't really sure if it was broken or not, but he wanted to play.
His jaw,
hit him in the jaw. And as it turned out, it wasn't broken, but it was not very pleasant. So he played. He managed, I think, to play at least the first period, and then he sat it out. Then he didn't come back out on the ice for the rest of the game. And then after the game, as teammates, Dave Dryden and others had told me, he said they remember there was this discussion of, because they were going to take the bus back to Buffalo. Are they going to take the bus is Tim going to come with the bus? Is Tim's going to drive himself? Is maybe one of us, are we going to go with Tim? All Tim they knew was that he had a doctor's appointment the next morning with the team doctor in Buffalo to get this jaw x-rayed. And instead of driving straight back, he actually went to the office of Tim Hortons in Oakville, and he had a meeting with Ron Joyce. And Ron concedes, multiple times that they were drinking that night. They sat around for like 4 hours talking about everything under the sun.
This is after the game.
This was after the game.
So we're into the wee small hours of the morning.
Really,
now.
he's played an NHL game, or at least a good part of it. And then they had this meeting. He said he left at 4. He said he wanted Tim to go to his house because he lived in Burlington at the time. And Tim said, no, I'm going back to Buffalo. And as Ron would tell the story, he said he gave me this sort of sloppy kiss on the cheek, said, I love you, blub, got in his car and drove off, speeding down. And that was the last anybody had any contact with him. He lost control of the car at pretty high speed at St. Catharines. It was thrown from the vehicle and killed at that point.
Punch Imlach
Right.
always said, Punch is running Buffalo now, right? The ex-Leaf coach is now running Buffalo. He said that damn car.
Yeah.
Because Tim wanted that car to come back and play for
And Punch wanted Tim to come back. So the story of Tim's career for the last couple of years was that he was always retiring. He'd come to the end of every season, he'd say, I'm done, I've had enough of this. You know, he's got this donut. And Ron Joyce wanted him to quit the game. He wanted to focus, because Tim was not just a figurehead. He actually was a business guy. He paid a lot of attention to the real estate side of the business. He had real estate investments, commercial real estate. He was pretty good at citing stuff like restaurants. That was his strength in the business. But every year, somebody was going to offer him more money. And he was at a point in the career, as I said earlier, I mean, the WHA had come along, NHL expansion had come along. There was more money in the game than there had ever been before. A guy like Tim could make $150 grand, which now seems like nothing for a professional player.
For a guy born in the 40s in Timmins, Ontario.
In 1960, he was making about 12, and that was a really good salary for the NHL in the 1960s. So the longer he stayed, the more money he could make. So they kept offering him cash, and in fact, he got to the point where he was splitting his salary with Joyce. He just said, look, I will play, I will make this money, I will pay you half of it so you run the business for me, and I keep playing NHL hockey. So in the last season, Punch did the thing again, here's the money, but I'll throw in a car. I'm going to buy you a sports car. And he gave him a Ford Pantera.
After Tim's death, you pointed out there is a resolution that has to happen in case of the business. Ron Joyce buys out Tim's widow.
Right.
What did he pay for it?
The way that it worked very quickly is that there was a share trust structure where whichever partner died first would end up basically with 50.5% of the company. Neither partner would be in equal partnership with whoever's other heirs were. So the moment Tim died, Laurie had 49.5% of the company, and Joyce had 50.5%. So he was in control. And it was pretty clear, I mean, by Laurie's own testimony, she was not mentally competent. She had never really been involved in the business. She was actually a very bright woman. I really enjoyed meeting her when I was able to in the 1990s. And this was not going to work. And he wanted to buy her out. So Laurie got a valuation from her own side. I think the number was around $800,000. And so the parties came together, and it was like, let's call it $1 million, and you can have the company car, because Laurie did have a company car, a Cadillac. So they did the deal.
Now, in hindsight, that looks ridiculously low, given what the company's worth today.
And that's what happened was in the mid-90s, early mid-90s, when she was suing, she wanted half the company as it existed then, and it was about to be bought by Wendy's, and it was going to make Ron Joyce an extremely wealthy man. I think what the suit, and we don't have time to get into the whole thing of the suit, but the suit, it was very clear from the judge's ruling that they did not find Laurie particularly credible as a witness. And one of the difficulties she had was, her case was that she had been mentally incompetent at the time, and could have been taken advantage of, and was, in fact, she had to sue her own lawyer to say, I wasn't, like, my valuation wasn't done properly on your side, never my side, never mind the other side. But she had to say, now I'm competent. I wasn't competent then, but I got better. And that's not particular, as I understand it, in case law like this. It didn't fly very well. There was actually an offer, as my understanding was, in the midst of the case, that she could have been paid basically an annuity. And it would have all gone away. Ron would have just, or Tim Hortons would have said, here's so much a year, at least you'll be taken care of, because she'd burned through all the money they had. They'd sold the cottage, and she refused. She wanted, it was a gamble of all or nothing. And it was clear from the judge's ruling that it was a hopeless, gambit.
So
whether it was really worth $1 million is the $1 million question. And that's something it's 2020 hindsight, but.
What's Ron Joyce worth today?
I don't think we even know, because the tax structures of how his deal was done. I mean, he certainly was that when Wendy's did the quote merger with Tim Hortons, and he was bought out as the majority shareholder, it certainly left him hundreds of millions of dollars ahead, which was good for a guy that was an ex-cop with a Dairy Queen franchise when he started.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Tim Hortons corporately. How do they do, in your view, at corporate social responsibility?
One of the things I wrote about in the book, and now it's been a couple years, and we are under a different ownership now. It's 3G, and I don't have great expertise on them. But one of the things I found looking at Tim Hortons is what they've done well is whenever they've had a controversy, they've managed to respond in excess of maybe what you expected them to do. They get some program going, they get some initiative going on recycling or recycling tins or cans or whatever. So they've always done well on that, of getting on the message and getting on top of what may be a problem for them. I'm not even sure how much the temporary foreign workers thing has really stuck to them. That was an interesting case that was just starting to kind of come on the horizon when I wrote this book, and I referred to it a little bit, but the scale of TFW in the fast industry it was not really quite clear what I did.
But they got attacked on animal welfare. They got attacked on litter, and both.
And they still do on litter. I mean, people still want to take pictures. Look, here's these Tim Hortons cups. There's paper all over the place, and you can put all the recycle bins you want in your drive-through lane. But if your customers are walking away and just chucking cups wherever they go, it is an issue. It's an issue, widespread.
Let's talk about Timmies and Tories. Somehow, Tim Hortons became inextricably linked, in particular with the Mike Harris Conservatives in Ontario and the Stephen Harper Conservatives federally.
Right.
How did that marriage happen?
I think you have to back up to the idea that Tim Hortons somehow represented the mushy middle class of Canadian life and values. And I don't think Tim Hortons even did much to get that going. It's not even a joke. I really legitimately feel that when Air Force started its donut sketch in 1993, they created the Donut Gang, which was kind of four quasi-idiot savant, or how many Canadians sitting around a table, as you remembered, just hashing out the issues of the day. They never, to my recollection, they never identified it with a Tim Hortons.
They didn't have to.
They didn't have to. But at the same time, what's interesting, in 1993, because it was a generic donut shop, at the time, as I said, Tim Hortons was maybe 900,000 places. If somebody watching that lived in Winnipeg or Thunder Bay, they would have said, oh, that's my Robin's Donuts, because they were really big. Or somebody in Quebec would have actually said, well, that's my Dunkin's, because Dunkin's was really big in Quebec. But by 2000, 2001, when that recession hit, a lot of Tim Hortons competitors, for a lot of very complicated reasons, got into trouble. And Tim's became really, in the early 2000s, the juggernaut it is. So suddenly the Donut Gang, the idea of the Tim Hortons voter, the gathering in a donut shop, it really became exclusively Tim Hortons.
I mean, the great irony of this is Tim Hortons, coffee.
Yes.
Stephen Harper doesn't drink coffee.
No. And when he famously did he didn't go to the UN for a key meeting. Instead, he did a stand-up when Tim Hortons was repatriated after it was spun off, and I believe he was drinking hot chocolate when he was standing there doing it.
Yeah. Let's talk about Timmy's. Of course, is huge in Canada. They have tried to go international, and they tried to take Broadway. How did that effort to move into New York City go?
New York didn't go well. I went down and looked at a bunch of the midtown places, and I think it was kind of an opportunistic move where there was a franchisee with, I believe, Dunkin's that was having a bit of an argument with head office, and so they just swapped. They said, let's get in there now and swap them all over. They aren't the Tim Hortons experience that most people know. They're not even the Tim Hortons experience that people in like upstate New York and Michigan would know, where it is like full restaurants, drive-through, all that kind of thing. Tim Hortons has done, I think, reasonably okay, if that's a term in business, in things like New York, Michigan. In Ohio, when Wendy's owned them, they instantly put in 40-odd restaurants by buying an Arby's-type chain and just swapping, them all over to Tim Hortons in one go. They got their hat handed to them in New England. They actually had to retreat in Maine, where people I knew in Maine, the Mainers, loved their Tim Hortons, but they weren't doing well enough. And so one of the things I try to impress upon Canadians is that, and Canadians who travel would know this, is that the United States is surprisingly a very large country with a lot of people, and they love food, and they have a lot of food choices of their own. And not only just national brands, but they have regionals that are very strong. So something like Caribou Coffee, which as I use as an example, which Canadians generally have no idea what it is actually a very strong chain out of Minnesota, and you will see it, as you travel around central U.S., eastern U.S. And so for Tim Hortons to expand, it's got to run into these things that people in America already love, and they don't have the cultural roots that Tim Hortons does in attachment to it.
Let's finish up on where they go from here. They serve 80% of the coffee that Canadian restaurants serve. 80%. How do you improve on that?
Well, it's been an issue for them because at some point the market becomes saturated. So they've had to look at strategies like, how do we get restaurants into small towns? How do we get to 5,000 seats or less? I mean, population or less. How do we make that work efficiently? How do you get, if you've got a finite number of customers who make a finite number of visits, how do we get what they call the ticket price up? Instead of spending $3.50 every visit, we got to get them up to $5. We have to get them to eat lunch. We have to get them maybe a more expensive lunch. That's what restaurants end up having to do, is to take what you have and try to make more out of it instead of it's just a coffee and a walk out the door. So yeah, there's no question. There's a point where Tim's just reaches a plateau in Canada and there's really nowhere else to go. And then if your model is growth and more revenue and more you've got to find it somewhere else.
I know you're not supposed to ever say never,
right?
Because Kodak is no longer with us,
right?
And BlackBerry certainly isn't what it once was,
right?
But is Tim Hortons about as bulletproof as it gets in Canadian business?
I'd say it's fairly sturdy. I think the current management is going to have to do something like try to run the place so lean and mean that the margins mean they have to really lean super hard on the franchisees. The franchisees get really, really pinched, then the customer's going to start feeling it in the quality of service or the staffing levels or things like that. I think the reality of Tim's is that it has such a trust relationship with customers, and it has such an incredibly huge, what do you call, installed base, where you have to make a conscious decision not to go to Tim Hortons if you want a coffee. I mean, where I live in a little community, Midland, Penetang, there's like 5 Tim Hortons. There's 1 McDonald's if you don't count the Walmart's counter. So if I'm driving around town or want to meet somebody, and I just literally did this yesterday, I was meeting somebody for an interview, and it's like, where do you want to meet? Oh, let's go to Tim Hortons. So then you don't know where they are, they don't know where you are, but you know that between the two of you, one of these 5 places will fit. So the point is that if I really want a coffee, and McDonald's makes a good coffee with McCafe with their expensive $30,000 machines, but you really have to decide, I just don't want to go to Tim Hortons now. Where is that McDonald's? Or where is that second cup that I can drive to next? And it's a hard habit to break.
Gotcha. History of it's all in Double Double, how Tim Hortons became a Canadian way of life, 1 cup at a time. Douglas Hunter, good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.